Hey everyone, welcome to the Language of series. My name is Amy Lancy. I'm the owner and founder of Untold Story Enterprises. I am a communication consultant and I help my clients who happen to be business owners to speak their audience's language so they can make more sales and get more clients. So I have my good friend Dave Baldwin here. So Dave, can you just introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about yourself as well as what you do in your business?
Absolutely. So, yeah, my name is Dave Baldwin. Business is Baldwin Systems, and my focus is building systematic processes to overcome some of the most common growing pains that businesses run into when they're trying to scale up and really take things to the next level.
Awesome. So when you help businesses go through growing pains, can you just elaborate a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, I mean, so growing pains can be a lot of different things, but a lot of times what happens when it might be, for instance, you've got a solo business owner that's doing it all and then starts hiring staff. So then you've got to go from having all your knowledge up in your head to now having to train other people. You've got to have documented processes and procedures for things. You've got to manage people. You've got to manage a team. It's
Mhm.
fundamentally a different challenge than just trying to get customers in the door and make money and do all the work yourself. Then there's later stages in a business where you might have a team of 3 to 5 people, and you're now trying to grow to a team of 10, a team of 15, and a team of 20, maybe adding a second location at some point, thinking about things like franchising the business model. And at some point, you're going to now run into new issues where you can't just do more of what you did before. It's kind of like if you want to double the size of a recipe, you can't necessarily just double all of the ingredients and think that it's going to work the same way. There's fundamental changes that you have to make when you mature from a small business to a mid-sized business to a larger business. And at each of those different stages, you're going to run into those growing pains. And that's where I really like to focus my efforts, is to engineer a systematic solution, because generally what ends up happening is you've got to really rethink how you're doing business going forward, because what got you to where you are is not going to be what gets you to where you're going next.
Absolutely. And what does what language so what role does language play in all of this and what you
I'm
do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really a fascinating series when you brought this idea to me, because in my mind, I think language is fundamental to everything. I mean, because communication is really at the heart of every aspect of business. And I think that where in my case, one of the things I run into is you can focus on language that is about processes, and then there's language that is based on pride. And I think that if essentially the fundamental difference is if you focus on what you're doing in the verbs in the sentence versus the adjectives in the sentence, such as I am, you are, they are,
Yeah.
then what can happen is that the verbs and the process language tends to depersonalize the conversation and focus on what do we need to do about this to get to where we need to go, versus if you're focusing on that pride and identity language, you can create a culture of shame, because what happens is you start saying things like, well, this person's ineffective, this person's not organized, this person's lazy,
Mhm.
or I'm really good at this, and there's kind of a sense of arrogance to that. And instead of saying, well, let's see, I hit my numbers because I did steps 1 through 5. Did you take all those steps? No. Okay, great. Well, now you know what you got to do to get there. So you
I
can kind of
see.
see the qualitative difference there.
Yeah, it seems like when we talk about the language of shame or the language of pride, it's when people are really pointing the finger at each other to see who can take on the blame, versus if you take on the language of process, it's more about, okay, well, let's see what happened here. Let's get a bigger picture as to what we can do from here, and see how we move forward.
Yes.
It seems way more
Exactly.
empowering.
It moves away from a conversation about who is at fault versus what is the problem, what is the action steps. And I think in your line of work with sales and marketing, it really comes into play as well, because if you think about the language that you're using in your marketing materials, For instance, like let's say whether it's I mean, it all depends on what type of product or a service that you're selling, but I think that let's say for a company that sells weight loss solutions, you've got to be sensitive to the fact that you might have people in your audience that are dealing with a lot of shame about their weight or the condition
Yes.
of their body or something along those lines. And so if you use language that brings up that shame again, you're
Yes.
now going to have your audience associating you with the feeling of shame, and they're going to be repelled. I mean, they're not only repelled but offended by you, possibly even feel angry every time they see a mention of your brand, because
Yes.
they're associating you with a feeling of shame, and they might not even know why. But that's where you get that pride language. Pride essentially is at the root of shame as far as I see it. And so I think it really comes into play in every facet of a business, whether it's the operational side, whether it's marketing side, and with finances, it definitely comes up because people have got definitely pride and shame around the numbers in all different areas of the business.
Yes. I have to say that the language of shame, or the language of pride, they both correlate with each other. That if we're putting a visual to it, it's as if someone stabbed you and they're digging that dagger deeper and deeper with every single word, piece of shame that you're spreading. And it's one of those things where when I've worked with business owners with their sales and marketing, they want to, they know that they had to hit on those pain points, and at the same time, they don't recognize that the way they're talking about the pain points is shame inducing, and it's very repelling to their audience. And they're thinking, but I'm relating to my audience. Why is mentioning the pain points not working? It's like, well, you are mentioning the pain points, but the way you're presenting it is very off-putting, and not relatable, or it's relatable in the wrong sense. And you want to be seen as solution based, kind of like what you talk about the language of process. I see that as like a solution based kind of communication versus like, hey, I'm just going to talk about the problem and put you in the context of the problem. And so therefore you feel like you're the problem, and then keep going. And it doesn't make anyone feel good at all. So,
And I think you actually are kind of highlighting another aspect of where this language phenomenon shows up, is that if you have there's problem focused language and there's solution focused language.
yes.
And you can talk about a problem all day and not get any closer to a solution. So I think really in the marketing context, the goal is to get the audience to associate the brand with the solution, and associate the brand with a feeling of hope, with the ray of sunshine, with the light at the end of the tunnel. That they feel the pain on their own. They don't need that pointed out to them. What they need to have pointed out is that there is a way out of the pain. And I think in a business sense, where I'm more likely to focus in an operational context, everybody's feeling the pain, especially when you've got I mean, sometimes it shows up differently on a small team versus how it is in a large corporate type of environment where you have multiple teams that are forming a culture. But typically there's a pain in the background of the culture, and everybody's feeling it, whether anyone's talking about it or not. And maybe that pain could be a fear of layoffs around the corner. It could be discontent that nobody's making the money they want to be making, or it's a lack of trust. Lack of trust is a really big one in corporate cultures, where it's a fear of getting thrown under the bus, or all that kind of stuff. So the real key there is, and it may not necessarily be about marketing, if you want to improve operations, you want to streamline efficiency, a lot of that has to do with getting people on board and getting people to be willing to take the actions that's going to move that work culture forward. It's not about logic and process steps. I mean, that ultimately has to be adjusted, but you can have the greatest process in the world. If people aren't willing to do it, it doesn't matter. So a lot of what has to happen is you've now got to think about the language that you're communicating within your team, internally in the organization, externally to customers, up the chain to management whose buy-in you need, and then down the chain to people that are reporting to you. Also, laterally speaking to equal peers, because all of it is really a sales process at the end of the day. And you've got to get buy-in to make anything happen on any kind of a team. And I think that's a really big overlooked factor. I think people tend to think that we can just identify a logical solution and then give the orders and everybody will do it. But that's just not how humans work. So, so yeah, when you think about this language context, that's really some of the things that come to mind for me, is that what words impacts people in an emotional way, for better or for worse. And it's not about trying to manipulate that so much as it's about just being aware of it, being just tuned into how people respond when you use certain words and certain images.
Mhm. Absolutely. Right before we got on this call, I had a conversation with I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and she was saying how communication helps to bridge the gap to talk about the stuff that is uncomfortable. I mean, would you say that the language of process helps to talk about uncomfortable things in a way that is less triggering?
I would say so, because process language, if you think about your language framework in terms of process, and you look at the subjects that you experience as uncomfortable, most likely you're not using process language to talk about those things. You're using the language of pride and shame
Mhm.
to talk about who is the problem. Or I mean, typically when you have that feeling of shame, that's where the feeling of discomfort comes from, because you're either trying to pin it on somebody else or trying to avoid having it pinned on you.
Mhm.
And when you have the elephant in the room, such as the dysfunctional team member that nobody can stand, but maybe that team member is in an influential position, maybe it's the boss, maybe it's the CEO of the company, and or maybe it's usually somebody in close proximity, and there's that ugly situation that just happened last week and nobody wants to talk about it because it's a sore spot.
Yeah.
Those are, if you really think about the language that you naturally think of, I'd be willing to bet that in most cases the language is rooted in shame, in terms of this person is the problem, this person is some not nice things, or whatever that is. And the problem is that if you pin that blame on somebody else, there's nothing you can do about it, because you can't change the other person. The only thing you can change is the process.
Mhm.
People are the way they are. And the other problem is that I don't know how anybody is. I only know how I perceive somebody else's character attributes, and my perception may not be accurate at all.
Mhm.
So whether it is accurate or not, I can't change it. But if I focus on the process and I say, well, we did A, B, and C, A, B, and C caused the problem. You may disagree with me about that, but if we focus the discussion on process and not on defaming people's character, we are
Mhm.
much more likely to get to a solution than we are in the other default way that we go about things as people.
Absolutely. And I know that, I mean, knowing you for quite some time now, I know that you've taken on a leadership position for, various things you've been involved with, as well as taking on the conflict management part when it comes to stuff with your business, stuff with your clients. And I know we're talking about the language of process, and you've probably applied that to people who have started to maybe use the language of shame, or unconsciously used it, and it might have been an easier turnaround with them to teach them what the language of process is. Now, for someone who has had their business for quite a while and has unconsciously been using the language of shame without even realizing it, and it's something that's probably a habit, you know, for someone like that, and for you in the position that you're in as a service provider, how how do you personally go about disrupting disrupting the language of shame for the client that I kind of hypothetically threw out to you just now? Someone who needs to exercise the habit of using the language of process.
I quite honestly would not try to disrupt that language in somebody else. I think it always starts with a self focus. And I think the danger of trying to change somebody else's language is you're more likely going to make them more determined to stay the way they are. So I think self focus is really the key. So I think that my approach to thinking about language as it affects all processes within an organization is, as I've got to start with myself and ask the question of what can I model for
Yeah.
this group of people,
Hmm.
versus what, and instead of saying what can I lecture everybody else about what they should do or what we all should do,
Hmm.
because the problem is if I start talking about what we should do, what people are going to hear is I'm telling you what you should do. And that's just going to make people defensive. That's actually going to reinforce that language of pride.
Yeah.
So instead, my tendency would be to look at, is there somewhere that I'm feeding into this dynamic of shame? Am I pointing the finger at somebody else? Am I avoiding responsibility for something? Am I holding fast to a process that I already know is not going to work?
Hmm.
Am I just repeating old behaviors out of habit because I'm not thinking about it? Just to just kind of look at that and then say, first of all, what behavior can I change first? Because I'm a firm believer that if all I do is talk differently, but I continue to do all the same things, then that's the definition of hypocrisy. So the
Yeah.
all behavior change, any change in language that's meaningful and authentic has to be accompanied by a concurrent change in measurable, observable behavior at the same time. And I think that it's better to start with the behavior first, do something, observe a change in results, and then talk about what you did after you've done it. I think that's generally my approach with most of those types of situations.
So it sounds like the way that you lead by example is to use the language of process for yourself.
Yes, I try to think in terms of process language as much as I can and recognize that most language occurs unconsciously. So most of the things that the areas where I'm operating from a shame-based language context, I'm doing that unconsciously. So the goal is not to try to change my language as much as the goal is to become aware of what language that I'm using as much as possible. And then the more I become aware of it, then I begin to have the opportunity to exercise choice in the matter where it didn't occur as a choice before.
Mhm. And for anyone who's watching this, most likely they are a business owner themselves, whether they are starting out or they've had their business for quite a while. Do you have any tips as to how they can look at, whether or not they are using the language of process or the language of shame on a regular basis? Are there just any indicators that come to mind?
I mean, I think the real key is to look at goals and look at what's the gap between where you're trying to get to and your perceived ability to get there. And I think that's really the starting point. So for instance, let's say I've got a team of 5 people and I want to have a team of 20 in the next, 2 or 3 years or whatever. Or maybe it's, I want to be able to take a vacation because I haven't taken a vacation in 5 years. Maybe it's, I want to be making more money personally as a business owner and setting aside a nest egg for retirement, but it's not happening. Whatever that goal is, like what is it that you want to have happen that's not happening? And then look at what do you think you would need to do, process language here. What specific action steps would you need to take that you're currently not taking? And if you look at those areas closely enough, I mean, yes, that you may see that you're using shame language somewhere, but I think my general focus would be to focus on the positive, like what processes and systems do we need to put in place that are currently not there, so that you can start moving in the direction that you want to be moving in the areas where you're not getting there quickly enough.
Mhm. It's kind of similar to what I have clients ask me when they come to say, "Hey, what do we say to get our clients to buy from us?" And my first question is, "Well, what have you already said to them?"
Yep.
What are the words that have already been exchanged or been on the internet? What has already been tried? And so, yeah, I mean, it really just comes down to that self check-in of,
Well, then
okay,
you've also got the question of what are you making? What research have you done in the marketplace to determine if there's a market for that product? If there's no
mhm,
market, then it doesn't matter what you're saying because nobody's going to buy it. But it's very impersonal if you focus on the process side of it, because research, that's a process,
yeah,
production's a process, R&D is a process. So the question is, if people aren't buying what you're selling, great, what will they buy? How do we find out what they'll buy? How do we find out where they are? How do we find out what it is they'll respond to? all from a process angle instead of taking it personally.
Exactly. And do you feel like people resist the language of process? And if you do,
They definitely do. Yeah.
okay, I was gonna say why? Why do you think so?
Well, all resistance is unconscious, but I think there's a couple of things that come into when you look at the pride aspect of things. There is, I think sometimes people don't want to think in terms of processes. You know, you can see this when there's in a work environment, people don't want to talk about a process as giving, they want to take the credit for themselves. They don't want to give the credit to a process. There's some pride involved in saying, well, only I can do this. This is because I am special, because I am unique. I am good at this. Instead of saying, well, no, this is, I produce a superior product because I have a really good formula. I had a really good teacher that taught me how to execute this formula, and I diligently follow all 29 of these steps every single time. There's a very different quality to that, in that when you talk about it from a process standpoint, you get to feel some pride about that, but you also get to give credit to a process, and there's a humility to it as well. And I think that makes people, there's some people that makes them uncomfortable, because I think there's a side of human nature that makes us think, well, if it's a process that deserves the credit, then I can be replaced, and I don't want to be replaced. This my only, me being the only person who can do this, that's my job security. That's what keeps food on my table. I'm not giving that up to somebody else. So I think there's definitely an element of that. At least that's my theory. Not necessarily true with every person or to the same degree within different people, but I've definitely seen a lot of that.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of that too. I think from my standpoint, people have their own gifts and their unique abilities, and I think that when they think about processes, they think of something that's dry and boring and something that can you know it can't possibly take my special unique gifts and compromise it by making it into a process. And I think that that's another way shame comes in, not shame, pride comes into the picture, because like, well, shoot, I'm proud of this thing. If you put it into a process, I won't be as proud of it anymore. And so I think we're talking the same language here, but language, but I think it's just that I say that because some people who are watching this, they may feel like, hey, they're not talking to me, but I wanted to just bring in this little piece because I think that this kind of helps to shed a little bit of light that we could be talking about some people in the audience. So, and that's okay. And I think that the first thing about recognizing the language of shame is to acknowledge it and not be ashamed of it, because it's something that is unconscious and something that we can change. I think that's something to also note. So, all right, Dave, we are at the end, but before I let you go, how can people reach you?
People can find my website at dave-baldwin.com. Don't forget the hyphen. And my email is the same, just with Dave up front. So it's dave@dave-baldwin.com. They can reach me on my phone number is 919-723-7916.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for being on here. And everyone else, please stay tuned for more videos for the Language of series. We have a lot of cool guests coming on. All these people are dear friends of mine, and I can't wait to show that to you. So, yeah, see you later. Bye.